The silence of the Kansas plains was a language John Mercer understood. It was a vast, sprawling quiet, punctuated only by the whisper of the wind through the tall prairie grass and the distant, mournful cry of a hawk circling in the endless blue sky. For 10 years since his return from the mud and the madness of the fields of France, this silence had been his only true companion. The farm, 160 acres of stubborn, fertile soil that had been in his family for 3 generations, was not just his home. It was his fortress, the place where he had retreated to keep the ghosts of the Great War at bay. At 42, John was a man who looked older than his years. His face was a road map of a hard life, weathered by the sun and etched with lines of a sorrow that he never spoke of. His shoulders, once straight and proud in a soldier's uniform, were now slightly stooped, not from age, but from the invisible weight of memory. He worked his land with a relentless, solitary determination, his days a predictable, monotonous rhythm of plowing, planting, and harvesting. He spoke little, kept to himself on his rare trips into the small nearby town, and was known by his neighbors as a good, if deeply private man, a man best left to his own devices. His solitude was a carefully constructed shield. The noise of the world, the frantic, jazz-fueled energy of the cities, the empty chatter of social gatherings, was an unbearable reminder of a life he no longer felt a part of. The silence of his farm was a balm to his wounded soul. It was a quiet, empty place, and that was exactly how he wanted it. This self-imposed peace was shattered on a scorching afternoon in late August. He was mending a fence on the far edge of his property, the rhythmic thud of his hammer the only sound in the oppressive heat, when his dog, a loyal mutt named Buster, began to bark, a series of sharp, agitated yelps directed toward a small ditch near the property line. "What is it, boy?" John grumbled, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He walked over to the ditch, expecting to find a coyote or a rabbit. Instead, he found a girl. She was lying in a crumpled heap, half hidden by the tall grass. She looked no older than 16, her face pale and streaked with dirt, her lips cracked and blue. She was dressed in a thin, grimy shift dress, the kind of shapeless garment worn in factories or orphanages, and her bare feet were bruised and bloodied. A rough burlap sack lay on the ground beside her, a horrifying clue as to the nature of her journey. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged, a victim of heat stroke and profound exhaustion. John's first instinct, honed by years of avoiding complication, was to ride into town and fetch the sheriff. This was not his problem. This was a matter for the law. But as he looked down at her small, fragile form, at the raw, blistered soles of her feet, a different instinct took over. It was the long-dormant instinct of the man he had once been, a soldier, a protector, a man who did not abandon the wounded on the battlefield. With a deep, weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his decision, he gently scooped her up into his arms. She was as light as a bag of feed, a testament to days or perhaps weeks of starvation. He carried her back to his farmhouse, the small, sturdy building that had not seen a female presence since his mother had passed away a decade ago. He laid her on the simple cot in the spare room, her small, broken form a stark contrast to the quiet, masculine order of his home. He worked with a practiced, almost forgotten efficiency. He was not a doctor, but he had seen more than his share of wounded bodies in the war. He bathed her face with a cool, damp cloth, forcing small sips of water between her cracked lips. He cleaned and bandaged her wounded feet, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle. As he tended to her, he saw the marks of her past life, the faint crisscrossing scars on her back, visible through a tear in her thin dress, the calloused, needle-pricked tips of her fingers. This was a child who had known nothing but hard labor and cruelty. She was a fugitive, a refugee from a different kind of war. For 2 days, she drifted in and out of consciousness, caught in a feverish, tormented sleep. John sat with her, a silent, watchful guardian. He fed his animals, worked his fields, but his mind was always in the small, quiet room where the strange, broken girl lay. Her presence was a profound disruption to his carefully ordered solitude, and yet, he found, to his own surprise, that it was not an unwelcome one. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet, powerful purpose of caring for another human being. On the third morning, he entered the room to find her awake. She was sitting up, her wide, terrified eyes, the color of a stormy sky, fixed on him. When he took a step closer, she flinched, scrambling backwards on the bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin like a shield. He stopped, his heart aching at the raw, animal fear in her eyes. This was a child who expected nothing but pain from the world, especially from men. He did not speak. He simply placed a bowl of warm oatmeal and a glass of milk on the small bedside table, then backed away slowly, giving her space. He sat in a wooden chair on the far side of the room, his presence quiet and unthreatening. "My name is John Mercer," he said softly, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "This is my home. You are safe here." She watched him, her eyes wide, for a long, silent moment. She looked at the food, then back at him. Slowly, tentatively, as if expecting a blow at any moment, she reached for the bowl. Her hands trembled as she lifted the spoon to her lips. She ate the oatmeal with a desperate, ravenous hunger. When she was finished, she looked at him again, the fear in her eyes now mingled with a flicker of confusion. "Why?" she whispered, her voice a hoarse, unused sound. "Why are you helping me?" John looked at this broken, terrified child who had washed up on the shores of his lonely life. He thought of the world he had left behind, a world of noise, of cruelty, of men who would do this to a child and call it industry. "Because," he said, the truth of it simple and profound, "this is a safe place. And it has been a long time since this house has had a good enough reason to be one." The days that followed were a delicate, silent dance. Rose remained in the small, spare room, a frightened bird in a strange new nest. The terror that had been her constant companion on her long journey from Chicago was slow to recede. Every creak of the old farmhouse floorboards, every shadow cast by the setting sun, sent a jolt of fear through her. She had escaped one cage, but her mind had not yet accepted that this was not another. John Mercer understood this. He had seen men in the trenches, men who had survived the horrors of the battlefield, only to be haunted by the ghosts of what they had endured. He recognized the look in her eyes, the constant, hyper-vigilant watchfulness of a soul that has learned to expect nothing but pain from the world. And so, he proceeded with a quiet, infinite patience. He never entered her room without first knocking softly and announcing his presence. He would leave a tray of food on a small chair just inside the door. Simple, nourishing meals of fresh bread, warm milk from his own cow, and hearty vegetable stew. And then he would retreat, allowing her to eat in the privacy of her own solitude. He spoke to her in a low, calm voice, his words simple and reassuring. He asked nothing of her. He simply offered her the unspoken gift of safety. Slowly, tentatively, the frightened bird began to lower its defenses. Rose started to venture out of her room, first just to the kitchen for a glass of water, her movements as silent and as cautious as a deer at the edge of a clearing. She saw the house was clean, orderly, and profoundly masculine. It was a place of function, not of comfort. There were no curtains on the windows, no pictures on the walls, no sign of any life beyond the basic daily routines of survival. It was the home of a man as solitary as she was. She found him one afternoon on the back porch, mending a piece of leather harness, his large, calloused hands surprisingly nimble. He did not seem to notice her at first. Buster, the dog, came over and nudged her hand with his wet nose, his tail wagging, a friendly, welcoming presence. "He likes you," John said without looking up from his work. "He doesn't like most people." "I had a dog once," Rose whispered, her voice still hoarse from disuse. "Back before." It was the first piece of her past she had offered him. John simply nodded, accepting the small, fragile gift of her words. He did not press for more. The full story came a few days later, during a quiet, cool evening. A gentle rain was falling outside, a soothing, percussive rhythm on the farmhouse roof. They sat in the main room, a fire crackling in the hearth, the first fire John had bothered to light for himself in years. He had noticed her shivering earlier. She began to speak, her voice a low, hesitant monotone at first, as if recounting a story that had happened to someone else. She told him of her parents, German immigrants who had come to America with dreams of a better life, only to be taken by the influenza epidemic years earlier, leaving her an orphan at 12. She spoke of the grim, state-run orphanage and of the day on her 16th birthday when she had been signed over on an indentured servitude contract to the Atlas textile mill in Chicago. As she spoke, the emotional dam she had so carefully constructed began to crack. Her voice grew thick with the memory of the factory. She described the deafening roar of the looms, the air so thick with cotton dust it was a struggle to breathe, the 16-hour days of mind-numbing, repetitive labor. She spoke of the overseer, a cruel, brutish man named Mr. Grant, who ruled the factory floor with an iron fist and a leather strap. She spoke of the hunger, of the cold, of the utter, soul-crushing hopelessness of a life that was, in all but name, a form of slavery. He liked to make examples of the younger girls, she said, her voice dropping to a pained whisper as she stared into the flames. There was a girl, Anna. She was only 13. She was sick. Her cough was terrible. She dropped a spindle and Mr. Grant, he dragged her to the front of the room. He said she was lazy. He began to beat her with his strap. Tears streamed down her face now, hot and silent. I don't know what came over me. I couldn't watch it. I threw myself in front of her. I took the blows for her. She looked up at John, her stormy eyes full of the memory of the horror. He was so angry. He locked me in the cold cellar for 2 days with no food. I knew when he let me out, it would be worse. I knew I would not survive it. So, that night, I ran. I climbed out a small window, and I just ran. She told him of her harrowing journey, of hopping freight trains, of stealing food from farms to survive, of walking for days until her feet were a bloody, raw mess, until the world had finally dissolved into a black, merciful unconsciousness in a ditch on the edge of his farm. John listened to her entire story without saying a word. His face was a stoic, unreadable mask, but his hands, resting on his knees, were clenched into white-knuckled fists. He was a man who had witnessed the very worst of human cruelty in the trenches of France. He recognized the same brutal, ugly monster in the actions of Mr. Grant. He saw in the trembling girl before him not a fugitive, but a fellow veteran, a survivor of a different, but no less brutal, war. When she finished, a profound silence settled over the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire. "You are a soldier, Rose," he said finally, his voice a low, rough rumble of absolute conviction. She looked at him, confused. "I am a runaway." "No," he insisted, his gaze intense. "You are a soldier. You threw yourself in front of a comrade to save her from the enemy. That is an act of courage I have seen only a handful of times in my entire life. You are not a victim. You are a hero." His words, his reframing of her story from one of shame to one of honor, were the most powerful medicine she had ever received. He did not offer her pity. He offered her a warrior's respect. He stood up and walked to the old locked gun cabinet that stood in the corner of the room. He unlocked it and took out a long, heavy service rifle. It was his old M1917 Enfield from the war. "Those men," he said, his voice cold and hard as steel, "they will likely come looking for you. They will see you as a piece of their property. This is an isolated place. The law is a long way away. A person out here needs to know how to protect themselves." He held the rifle out to her. "Tomorrow morning I am going to teach you how to shoot. You will no longer be the girl who runs. You will be the woman who stands her ground." It was not a request. It was a declaration. It was an offer. He was not just offering her a roof over her head. He was offering her a way to reclaim her own power. He was offering her a partnership in their shared survival. Rose looked from the rifle to the determined, protective look in his eyes. For the first time since she had left Chicago, the fear in her heart began to recede, replaced by a new, fragile but fiercely burning ember. It was the feeling of hope, not for a rescue, but for a fight she now knew she would not have to face alone. The first lesson took place at dawn. The sky was a pale, soft gray, the air cool and clean with the scent of damp earth. John led Rose to a wide open pasture at the far end of the farm, a place where the only audience was a vast empty sky and a few curious cows. He held the M1917 Enfield with a familiar, grim reverence. For him, this rifle was a tool of death and a relic of a past he had tried to bury. Today, he was determined to transform it into an instrument of empowerment for her. "A weapon is not a toy," he began, his voice the low, steady tone of a drill sergeant, yet devoid of any harshness. "It demands respect. It demands a clear mind and a steady hand." Rose, who had never held anything more dangerous than a sewing needle, listened with a grave, focused intensity. She was a quick study. Her years in the factory, though brutal, had given her a unique set of skills, an immense capacity for focus, an unwavering steadiness of hand, and a complete lack of fear when it came to hard, demanding work. He showed her how to stand, how to brace the heavy wooden stock against her shoulder, how to breathe. In, hold, and then a slow, steady exhale as she squeezed the trigger. He stood behind her, his large hands gently adjusting her posture, his presence a warm, solid wall at her back. She was intensely aware of his closeness, of the quiet strength that emanated from him. It was the first time in her life a man had stood so near without it being a threat. This was different. This was a gift of strength. When she fired the first shot, the kickback was more powerful than she had expected. But her aim was true. The bullet struck the tin can he had set up on a fence post 50 yards away with a satisfying ping. A slow, rare smile of admiration touched John's lips. She was a natural. Their days settled into a new, purposeful rhythm. They were no longer a farmer and a refugee. They were partners in a shared enterprise of survival. While he taught her the ways of the farm, how to mend a fence, how to milk the cow, how to read the sky for signs of changing weather, she in turn began to transform his house. The farmhouse had been a place of mere existence, a shelter from the elements, not a home. It was clean but sterile, a reflection of the man who had closed himself off from the world. Rose, with her quiet, innate need to nurture, began to coax it back to life. She found a trunk in the attic filled with his mother's old things, hand-stitched quilts, faded floral curtains, and a small collection of cherished recipe books. Slowly, carefully, she began to reintroduce these ghosts of a happier past into the present. She washed and hung the curtains, their soft faded colors a gentle rebellion against the starkness of the rooms. She placed the quilts on the simple beds, their warmth a silent comfort. And from the old recipe books, she began to cook. For the first time in a decade, the house was filled with the warm, comforting aromas of baking bread, of rich, slow-simmering stews, of apple pie spiced with cinnamon. For John, these scents were a form of time travel, transporting him back to a life before the war, a life of simple, uncomplicated happiness. He had not realized how starved his soul had been for the simple, profound comfort of a home-cooked meal. He began to talk more. As they shared their meals at the small kitchen table, he would tell her about the farm, about his parents, about the quiet, simple boy he had been before the world had demanded he become a soldier. But the war was never far away. Some nights he would wake with a start, the sound of artillery echoing in the phantom landscape of his dreams. He would come out to the porch, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat, his eyes haunted. One such night, Rose found him there, staring out at the dark, silent fields. She did not speak. She simply came and sat in the rocking chair beside him, her presence a quiet, steady anchor in his turbulent internal sea. After a long silence, he began to speak of the war, not of the battles or the strategies, but of the men he had lost, of the crushing weight of a captain's responsibility for the lives of others. He spoke of the guilt, a burden he had carried alone for 10 years. She listened, her heart aching for him. And when he finished, she simply reached out and placed her hand on his, a gesture of profound, shared understanding. In that moment, she was no longer the frightened girl he had rescued. She was his equal, a fellow survivor, offering him the same quiet, healing sanctuary he had offered her. Their bond, forged in a shared need for survival, was now being tempered by a growing, unspoken affection. It was in the way he would leave a small, perfect wildflower for her on the kitchen table in the mornings. It was in the way she would ensure his favorite quilt was waiting for him on his chair by the fire in the evenings. It was in the easy, comfortable silences that now fell between them. Silences that were no longer empty, but filled with a deep mutual respect and a burgeoning tender care. They were building a life together, a small fragile fortress of peace and routine against the threat of the outside world. They knew the men from Chicago would come eventually. The outside world, with all its cruelty and greed, would one day find its way to their door. But on a cool evening in late September, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set in a blaze of glory over their fields, a profound sense of peace settled over them. The house behind them was warm and filled with the scent of freshly baked bread. Buster, the dog, slept at their feet. For the first time in a very long time, neither of them felt like a soldier, or a fugitive, or a ghost. They simply felt like two people who were, against all odds, finally home. The quiet of the evening was broken by a sound from the long dirt road that led to the farm. It was the low, unmistakable rumble of an approaching automobile engine. John looked at Rose. Their peaceful idyll was over. The world had found them. He stood up, his face set in a hard, resolute line, and walked into the house. He returned a moment later with the Enfield rifle, which he handed to her. He then picked up his own hunting shotgun. "Stay on the porch," he said, his voice a low, calm command. "But be ready." He then walked down the steps to stand in the middle of the yard, a solitary, unmovable figure, waiting to face the ghosts of her past, together. The Ford Model T, a brutish black beetle against the golden landscape of the setting sun, kicked up a plume of dust as it roared up the long dirt drive. It came to a screeching, aggressive halt in the middle of the yard. The doors flew open, and 4 men emerged. 3 were large, thuggish-looking men in city clothes that looked awkwardly out of place in the rural quiet. The man who led them, however, was the one who made the blood in Rose's veins turn to ice. It was Mr. Grant. He was just as she remembered him from the factory, a stout, powerful man with a cruel, sneering mouth and small, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He surveyed the scene, the simple, well-kept farmhouse, the lone figure of John Mercer standing in the yard, and the small, determined shape of Rose on the porch, with a look of smug, proprietary confidence. He was a predator who had finally cornered his escaped prey. "Well, well," Grant called out, his voice a familiar, grating sound that made Rose's old wounds ache. "Look what we have here. A runaway thief and the old soldier who's harboring her." "I have a contract, Mercer," he said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "An indentured servitude contract. This girl is the property of the Atlas textile mill until she has worked off her debt. I'm here to collect what belongs to us." John Mercer did not move. He stood, his feet planted firmly in the soil his father and grandfather had worked, the shotgun held loosely, almost casually, in the crook of his arm. He looked at Grant with the cold, dead-eyed calm of a man who had faced down German machine gun nests. This city bully, with his hired thugs, did not intimidate him in the slightest. "There is no property of yours on this land, Mr. Grant," John said, his voice a low, flat rumble that carried easily in the quiet air. "There is only a young woman who I have given my protection to. This is my farm. I suggest you and your men get back in your car and leave it." Grant laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Are you threatening me, old man? There are 4 of us and 1 of you. Don't be a fool. Just give us the girl and we'll be on our way. We have no business with you. You made it my business when you beat a child and locked her in a cellar," John replied, his voice still dangerously calm. "I've seen men like you before in the war, men who find their courage in the suffering of others. You are cowards. and you are not welcome on my land." The insult, delivered so quietly, so matter-of-factly, struck a nerve. Grant's face darkened with rage. "You'll regret this, farmer," he snarled. He gave a sharp nod to his men. "Get the girl." Two of the thugs began to advance, spreading out to flank John. It was the moment they had prepared for. On the porch, Rose's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, terrified bird. She saw the men advancing, saw John raise his shotgun slightly. She remembered the long, patient hours he had spent with her in the pasture, the feel of the heavy Enfield rifle in her hands, his calm voice in her ear. Breathe in, hold, and a slow, steady squeeze. Do not be afraid of the noise. Be the master of it. The men were halfway across the yard. They were sneering, confident, certain that this was almost over. They had forgotten about the girl on the porch. They saw her as the prize, the victim, not a threat. It was the greatest mistake of their lives. Rose lifted the rifle, bracing the stock firmly against her shoulder, just as John had taught her. She did not aim at the men. She aimed at the ground, a few feet in front of the right-hand thug's advancing foot. She took a breath. She held it, and she squeezed the trigger. The crack of the high-powered rifle was a deafening explosion that shattered the evening quiet, a sound far more powerful and terrifying than the simple blast of a shotgun. A geyser of dirt and dust erupted from the ground exactly where she had aimed. The thug cried out in shock and stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. The other men froze in their tracks, their confident sneers instantly replaced by looks of stunned disbelief. They all stared up at the porch, at the small, determined girl who now stood there, the long, heavy barrel of a military-grade rifle held with an unwavering, steady hand, a look of cold, righteous fury in her eyes. "The next one," she said, her voice ringing with a clear, powerful authority they had never imagined she possessed, "will not be aimed at the dirt." The standoff was absolute. The thugs looked from the unmovable farmer in front of them to the surprisingly deadly girl on the porch. This was not the easy snatch and grab they had been promised. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by a primal, sensible fear. This was not worth dying for. "Get in the car," Grant hissed at his men, his own face pale. He gave John one last look of pure, venomous hatred. "This isn't over." "Oh, I believe it is," John said quietly. They scrambled back into their Model T, turned the car around in a clumsy, panicked cloud of dust, and sped back down the road, disappearing into the twilight from whence they had come. For a long moment after they were gone, the only sound was the chirping of the crickets and the frantic, relieved barking of Buster the dog. The battle was over. They had won. John turned and looked up at Rose, who was still standing on the porch, the rifle held at the ready. He walked slowly towards her, his face a mask of a profound, overwhelming emotion she could not quite read. He mounted the steps and stopped before her. He gently took the heavy rifle from her trembling hands, his fingers brushing against hers. He looked down at her small, fierce, and beautiful face, and his heart was filled with a pride and an admiration so immense it almost hurt. He had seen courage in the trenches of France, but he had never seen anything as brave as what he had just witnessed. She was not a victim he had rescued. She was a soldier who had stood her ground and fought by his side. She was his equal. "I have never," he said, his voice a raw, emotional whisper, "been prouder to stand with another soldier in my entire life." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, a gesture of profound respect, of shared victory, of a deep and unspoken tenderness. In the quiet aftermath of the battle, surrounded by the warm, familiar sense of her new home, Rose looked up at the lonely war veteran who had become her protector, her teacher, her partner. And she knew, with a certainty that warmed her to her very soul, that the quiet, unassuming farmhouse on the Kansas plains was the safest and most beloved place on earth. The departure of Grant and his men left a silence on the farm that was deeper and more profound than any that had come before. It was not the empty silence of loneliness, but the ringing, breathless quiet that follows a battle won. The adrenaline slowly receded. leaving in its wake a trembling, raw, and unbreakable bond between the two people who stood in the yard. John looked at Rose, at her small, determined form, her knuckles white as she still gripped the heavy rifle. He saw not a frightened girl, but a warrior. He gently took the Enfield from her hands, the warmth of her skin a stark contrast to the cool steel of the weapon. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance, a new and unspoken truth was acknowledged. They had not just survived a threat, they had defended their home together. In the days that followed, the dynamic of their life on the farm was fundamentally altered. The quiet, careful dance of protector and protected was gone, replaced by the easy, comfortable rhythm of two equal partners. The invisible line that had separated them, the line of his age, of her past, of their unspoken griefs, had been obliterated in that single shared act of defiance. They worked the farm side by side, a seamless and efficient team. He would plow the fields, his strong, steady hands guiding the mule, and she would follow behind, planting seeds with a practiced, rhythmic grace. They spoke little, but their communication was constant, a language of shared glances, of small, understanding smiles, of a deep and abiding companionship that needed no words. The house, which she had so lovingly coaxed back to life, was now truly their shared home. The evenings were no longer about him teaching her or her caring for him. They were about them simply being together. They would sit on the porch swing after a long day's work, the gentle, creaking rhythm of the swing a peaceful counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. They would watch the sunset, a breathtaking spectacle of color that painted the vast, open sky, and in those quiet moments, they both felt a sense of peace that had long been absent from their lives. It was during one of these quiet, perfect evenings, about a week after the confrontation, that the unspoken truth between them finally demanded a voice. The air was cool and smelled of freshly cut hay and the rich, dark earth. John, who had been staring out at the horizon, finally turned to her. His face, usually so stoic and guarded, was open, his eyes full of an emotion that made her heart skip a beat. "I have been thinking about the day you arrived, Rose," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "I was a man half alive, a ghost, tending to the ghosts of my family on this land. I thought this farm was my fortress, a place to keep the world out. But it was a prison. I was just too lost to see the bars." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "And then you came. A frightened, broken girl. And I thought, here is someone more broken than I am. I thought I was helping you, rescuing you." He shook his head, a small, self-deprecating smile on his lips. "What a fool I was. I did not rescue you, Rose. You rescued me. You walked into the silence of my life, and you filled it with purpose, with warmth, with life. You reminded me what it felt like to have something worth fighting for." He took her small, calloused hand in his own. "When I saw you standing on that porch holding that rifle, ready to face down those monsters for me, for this home, I felt something I thought had died in the mud of France. It was not just pride, Rose. It was a fierce, protective, and overwhelming love. The confession, so simple and so profound, hung in the twilight air between them. It was the truth her own heart had known for weeks, but had been too afraid to acknowledge. "Oh, John," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "You taught me how to be a soldier. You taught me that I was not a victim. You gave me back my own strength. You looked at me and saw a hero when all I saw was a frightened runaway girl. How could I not love the man who gave me back my own soul?" He leaned forward, and in the soft purple glow of the prairie twilight, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic, youthful passion. It was a kiss of deep, profound recognition. It was a kiss that tasted of shared battles, of quiet comfort, and of a love that had been forged in the crucible of shared survival. It was a kiss that promised not a whirlwind romance, but a lifetime of steady, quiet, and unshakable partnership. When they broke apart, he did not release her hand. He looked at her, his love for her a clear, bright thing in his eyes. "I am a simple farmer, Rose," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have nothing to offer you but this land, this small house, and a heart that is, for the first time in a decade, whole. But it is all yours if you will have it." He did not have a ring. He did not have a grand speech. He had only the simple, honest truth of his heart. "Marry me, Rose Schmidt. Be my wife. Let us make this our home, our fortress, our life, together." She looked at this quiet, honorable, and impossibly good man, at the life they had already begun to build. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, a journey of pain and fear that had, against all odds, led her to this perfect, peaceful moment. Her answer was as simple and as true as the love in her heart. "Yes, John," she whispered, her voice full of a joyful, tearful certainty. "Yes, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms, and they held each other as the first stars began to appear in the vast velvet sky. The lonely war veteran and the fugitive factory girl were gone. In their place stood a man and a woman, a promised husband and a promised wife, their future as open and as full of possibility as the vast, beautiful prairie that stretched out before them. The days following their engagement were the happiest of John Mercer's life. The farm, once a silent testament to his solitude, was now a place of shared purpose and quiet, constant joy. The heavy, oppressive weight of the past, a burden he had carried for a decade, had finally been lifted, replaced by the light, hopeful presence of Rose. He worked his land not with the grim, monotonous determination of a man serving a sentence, but with the joyful energy of a man building a future. For Rose, the farm was a paradise of peace and safety. The terrified, haunted girl who had collapsed in a ditch felt like a distant memory, a character from a sad story she had once read. In John's quiet, steady love, she had found not just a sanctuary, but a home. She had discovered a deep, surprising connection to the land, her hands, once calloused by the repetitive motions of a factory loom, now finding a new, healthier purpose in the rich soil of her vegetable garden and in the warmth of the farmhouse kitchen. They were their own small, perfect world, a self-contained universe of two. But they both knew that to build a true life, they could not remain isolated forever. Their love, born in secret and forged in a shared battle, now needed the simple, ordinary light of day. They needed to get married, not just in their hearts, but in the eyes of the law and the community. The prospect of going into the town of redemption was a daunting one for them both. For John, it meant voluntarily ending his decade of self-imposed exile, of facing the curious and pitying stares of the people who still saw him as the haunted Mercer boy who had come back from the war, a broken man. For Rose, it meant facing the community as the mysterious young woman who had appeared from nowhere, her past a subject of wild and imaginative gossip. "We will go together," John had said, his hand covering hers, a simple, powerful statement of their new reality. And so, on a bright, clear Saturday morning, they hitched the old horse to the buggy. The automobile, for all its speed, felt too much like the vehicle of their past troubles, and made the journey into town. As they rode down Main Street, a palpable change rippled through the usual Saturday morning bustle. Conversations on the sidewalk quieted. The women gossiping outside the general store fell silent. All eyes turned to them, to the sight of the reclusive John Mercer, not on a quick, solitary supply run, but sitting proudly beside a young woman, a gentle, protective hand resting on her arm. Their first stop was the county courthouse, a small, dignified brick building to apply for their marriage license. The county clerk, a man named Mr. Abernathy who had known John since he was a boy, looked up over his spectacles, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and undisguised delight. "John Mercer," he said, a slow, wide grin spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be. It is good to see you, son. Truly good." His gaze shifted to Rose, his expression warm and kind. He did not ask questions. He did not pry. He simply saw the quiet, profound happiness on his old friend's face and understood. He processed their application with a cheerful, bureaucratic efficiency that was, in its own way, a profound act of acceptance. As they left the courthouse, the official license in John's hand, they felt as if they had passed the first great test. But the true trial, the court of public opinion, was still in session. They walked towards the general store, and it was there they were met by the town's chief gossip, a formidable woman named Martha Gable. "John and Miss Schmidt," she said, her voice a little too loud, her eyes sharp with a hungry curiosity. "How lovely to see you both out and about. We were all so concerned after that unpleasantness with those men from the city." "There is no need for concern, Martha," John said, his voice calm and steady. He gently squeezed Rose's hand, a silent signal of support. "Rose and I are quite well. In fact, we are to be married." The declaration, so simple and so direct, was a cannon blast in the quiet world of town gossip. Martha Gable was momentarily speechless. "Married," she finally managed to say. "Yes," John said, a small genuine smile on his face as he looked down at Rose with an expression of such open, honest love that it silenced any further questions. "Next Saturday at the church." It was at that moment that another woman stepped out of the store. It was Mrs. Henderson, the pastor's wife, a woman known for her quiet kindness and her deep, unshakable faith. She had a warm, genuine smile on her face. "Abigail, my dear," she said, pointedly ignoring Martha Gable and addressing Rose by her first name. "And John, we just heard the news from Mr. Abernathy. I am so very, very happy for you both." She took both of Rose's hands in her own. "Our church will be honored to host your wedding. You have brought a new light back to that man's eyes, child. You are a blessing." The simple, heartfelt acceptance from the pastor's wife was the final, definitive victory. It was a benediction, a welcome into the heart of the community. Martha Gable, seeing that the narrative had shifted from scandalous gossip to a celebrated romance, quickly changed her tune, offering her own flustered, insincere congratulations. The walk back to their buggy was different. The stares were still there, but they were no longer hostile or pitying. They were simply curious, interested. The town was not judging them. It was simply readjusting to a new, unexpected, and beautiful story. As they rode home, the afternoon sun warming their faces, a profound sense of peace settled over them. The final ghost, the ghost of public opinion, had been laid to rest. They were no longer two solitary fugitives hiding from the world. They were John and Rose, a couple, a future husband and wife, a part of a community that had, in its own hesitant way, finally welcomed them home. John looked at Rose, at her serene, happy face, and his heart was full. He had thought that his life of honor had ended in the trenches of France. But as he looked at the woman beside him, the woman who had faced down his ghosts, who had stood her ground against monsters, and who had taught him how to live again, he knew that his true life of honor, a life of love and partnership, was only just beginning. The marriage license, a simple piece of paper resting in his coat pocket, felt like the most important medal he had ever earned. The week leading up to the wedding was unlike any John Mercer had experienced in his adult life. His farm, once a bastion of solitary labor, became a cheerful hub of community activity. The news of his engagement to Rose had spread through Harmony Creek, not as a piece of gossip, but as a beloved local romance, a story the town had decided to claim as its own. Having witnessed their quiet dignity, the community now seemed determined to give them the celebration they deserved. Mrs. Henderson, the pastor's wife, arrived one afternoon with an armful of beautiful, ivory-colored lace. "This was from my own wedding dress, my dear," she said to Rose, her eyes shining. "My mother always said the lace held good fortune. I want you to have it for yours." Rose, who had planned to be married in her simple Sunday best, was moved to tears. Together they spent 2 long, happy afternoons in the farmhouse parlor, carefully altering one of John's late mother's dresses, a beautiful silk gown from the turn of the century, and adding the delicate, fortunate lace. It was the first time in her life Rose had ever had a dress that was truly special, made just for her. The other women from the town contributed in their own ways. The general store owner's wife declared she would be baking the wedding cake, a magnificent three-tiered lemon and poppy seed creation. Others brought jars of preserved flowers, strings of paper lanterns, and bolts of white ribbon to decorate the farm. The men, led by a cheerful county clerk, arrived on the Friday before the ceremony to build a small, rustic wooden arch in the heart of the vegetable garden Rose had so lovingly cultivated. The garden, a symbol of the new life she had brought to the barren farm, would be their church. For John, this gentle, willing invasion of his solitude was a strange and wonderful revelation. He had spent a decade keeping these people at a distance, and now they were here, on his land, not as intruders but as friends, all working together to celebrate his happiness. He saw his farm not through his own weary, haunted eyes, but through theirs, as a place of peace, of abundance, of home. The ghosts of the war, for the first time, felt very, very far away. On the morning of the wedding, he and Rose sat together on the front porch swing, a rare moment of quiet before the festivities began. The air was crisp and clear, the autumn sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. "Are you nervous?" he asked, his hand covering hers. "No," she said, looking out at the fields, at the life they had built. "I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life." She turned to him, her smile radiant. "I feel like I have been walking towards this porch, towards you, my whole life." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Every day since you arrived," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "has been the best day of my life. I cannot wait to begin our forever." The wedding was a masterpiece of simple, heartfelt beauty. The entire town seemed to be there, their faces full of genuine joy for the unlikely couple. Rose, escorted by the proud county clerk, walked down an aisle lined with smiling faces. She was breathtaking. The vintage silk dress, adorned with Mrs. Henderson's lucky lace, fit her as if it were made for her, her quiet beauty shining with a radiant, happy glow. John waited for her under the wooden arch. He was not a young man, but as he watched his bride walk towards him, the years seemed to melt away. He was a man who had been given a second chance at life, a chance he had never believed he deserved. Their vows, spoken in clear, steady voices as the afternoon sun cast a golden light over the garden, were a testament to their journey. "I came to you a broken man, Rose," John said, his voice ringing with a profound, humble gratitude. "A man hiding from a world I no longer understood. You walked into my silence, and you were not afraid. You stood by my side, you fought for our home, and you taught my heart how to live again. I promise to be your protector, your partner, and your loving husband for all of my days." Rose looked at this good, honorable man, her soldier, her farmer, her home. "I came to you a frightened girl with no future," she said, her own voice full of joyful tears. "You gave me a sanctuary. You taught me that I was a survivor, not a victim. You gave me a home and you gave me your heart. I promise to cherish that heart, to fill this home with laughter, and to love you with all that I am, always." When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, a great cheer erupted from the assembled crowd. John pulled his wife into his arms and kissed her, a deep, loving kiss that sealed their past and promised their future. The reception that followed was a joyous, raucous, beautiful affair. It was a true barn dance, held in John's large, clean-swept barn, which the town had decorated with strings of lanterns and autumn wildflowers. A local band played lively tunes, and the floor was filled with dancing couples. The tables groaned under the weight of a magnificent potluck feast, a collective gift from the entire community. John, the man who had not danced in over a decade, pulled his wife onto the dance floor and spun her around, his laughter a deep, happy sound that filled the rafters. He had never felt so alive, so connected, so completely and utterly at peace. Later that evening, long after the last guest had departed, leaving behind only the lingering scent of wood smoke and happiness, John and Rose stood on the porch of their farmhouse. The stars were brilliant in the vast, dark sky. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood in comfortable silence listening to the quiet, familiar sounds of the prairie night. The farmhouse was no longer just his or a temporary refuge for her. It was theirs. The lonely war veteran and the fugitive factory girl were gone. In their place stood a husband and a wife, two souls who had found their improbable, beautiful, and hard-won happy ending. The battle was over. The war for their hearts was won. And their life together, a quiet harvest of peace and love, had truly, officially begun. The first few years of their marriage were a quiet, beautiful poem written in the rhythms of the seasons. The Mercer farm, under the combined efforts of John's steady strength and Rose's nurturing spirit, thrived as it never had before. The house was a true home now, filled with the scent of Rose's baking, the warmth of the quilts she stitched in the evenings, and the easy, comfortable silence of two people who understood each other's souls. John, the man who had once been a ghost on his own land, was now fully present, his past grief replaced by a profound and quiet contentment. Rose, the girl who had arrived broken and terrified, had found not just a sanctuary, but her own unshakable strength, her roots finally planted in the rich, welcoming soil of a true home. Their love was a partnership in every sense of the word. They were a seamless team, their days spent working the land, their evenings spent in quiet conversation on the porch, watching the stars ignite in the vast prairie sky. They were their own small, perfect world. But the world outside their fence line was struggling. The late 1920s brought a creeping, insidious hardship to the small farming communities of the Midwest. The booming prosperity of the cities did not reach them. Instead, they faced falling crop prices, rising debt, and the ever-present threat of foreclosure from distant, faceless banks. John and Rose saw the worry etched on the faces of their neighbors during their weekly trips into town. They heard the hushed, desperate conversations about failing crops and loans denied. They saw good, hard-working families, people they had known their entire lives, on the verge of losing everything. It was a reality that resonated deeply with them both. John knew the bitter taste of helplessness, of fighting a battle against an overwhelming, invisible force. Rose knew the sharp, gnawing fear of poverty, the shame of having nowhere to turn. They could not stand by and watch their community crumble. The idea was born, as most of their best ideas were, during a quiet evening on the porch. "They are fighting alone," Rose said, her gaze fixed on the distant, flickering lights of a neighboring farm. "That is why they are losing. When I was in the factory, the overseers kept us apart, made us compete with each other. It was how they controlled us. People are stronger when they stand together." Her words, so simple and so wise, sparked an idea in John's mind, an idea rooted in his own past. "In the army," he said slowly, his mind drifting back, "we survived because we pooled our resources. One man had extra rations, another had dry socks. We shared what we had. We were a unit." He looked at her, a new, determined light in his eyes. "That's what we need here, a unit." And so, the Harmony Creek Farmers Cooperative was born. It was a radical idea for a community of staunchly independent, proud farmers who were accustomed to facing their struggles alone. But the man who proposed it was no longer the town recluse. He was John Mercer, a respected war hero and a successful farmer, a man who had earned their trust, and the woman who stood beside him, who championed the idea with a quiet, compassionate fire, was his beloved wife, Rose, a woman they had all come to admire for her strength and her grace. The project became their new shared purpose. John, with his methodical mind and his natural leadership, became the architect of the cooperative. He spent weeks traveling from farm to farm in his old buggy, patiently explaining the concept. He showed them the simple, undeniable math. By buying seed and equipment in bulk, they could lower their costs. By storing their grain together and selling it as a single large block, they could demand a better price from the powerful railroad and milling companies that had been exploiting them for years. He was not a politician making grand speeches. He was a farmer talking to other farmers in a language they understood. Rose was the heart of the cooperative. She knew that the community's needs went beyond mere finances. She organized the women, creating a network of support. They started a weekly potluck and meeting at the Mercer farm, a place for families to gather, to share their burdens, and to find strength in each other. She organized canning circles, sewing groups, and a small informal school in her own parlor for the children who lived too far from the main town. She was weaving the disparate, struggling families of the prairie into a single, resilient tapestry of community. They faced resistance, of course. The local bank manager, who profited from the high-interest loans he gave to desperate farmers, saw their cooperative as a direct threat. He spread rumors calling it a socialist experiment that was doomed to fail. But the trust the community had in John and Rose was stronger than the bankers' fear-mongering. One by one, the families signed on. The first test of their newfound unity came that autumn, at harvest time. The cooperative, representing 24 local farms, now controlled a significant portion of the county's wheat production. When the buyer from the big city mill arrived, offering the same insultingly low price as the previous year, John Mercer, acting as the co-op's elected spokesman, politely refused. "This is our price," John said, handing the buyer a new figure, one that was fair and just. "Take it, or we will ship our grain to your competitor in St. Louis." The buyer, accustomed to dealing with desperate individual farmers he could easily intimidate, was stunned. He blustered, he threatened, but John and the other farmers who stood behind him did not waver. They were a united front. In the end, the buyer had no choice but to agree to their terms. That night, the Mercer farm was the site of the most joyous celebration the county had seen in years. It was a harvest festival, a celebration of their shared victory. The barn was filled with music and dancing. The tables groaned under the weight of a magnificent feast, and the faces of their neighbors were filled with a new, powerful emotion: hope. As the party raged on, John and Rose slipped away to the quiet of their porch. They looked out at the barn, at the warm golden light spilling from its doors, at the sound of their friends and neighbors celebrating their collective strength. John wrapped his arm around his wife, his heart full. He had gone to war to fight for his country. He had returned to his farm to fight his own ghosts. But here, with this incredible woman by his side, he had finally found the most important battle of all: the quiet, steady, and profoundly honorable fight for his own community. "Look at what you've done, Rose," he whispered, his voice full of a quiet awe. "You have healed more than just this broken old soldier. You have healed this entire valley." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a contented smile on her face. Their love, born in the ashes of their separate, broken pasts, had grown into a great and sturdy tree, its roots now deep in the soil of this land, its branches providing shelter for all. The years that followed the Harvest Festival were a testament to the quiet, powerful idea that had been born on the Mercer farm porch. The Harmony Creek Farmers Cooperative became a fortress of stability in a world that was descending into the chaos of the Great Depression. While newspapers from the city screamed of bank failures, of bread lines, of families losing everything, their small corner of the Kansas prairie held firm. The co-op, built on the simple principle of mutual support, became a lifeline. The farmers of Harmony Creek were not immune to the hardships of the era, but they did not face them alone. They were a community, a unit, a family. At the heart of that family were John and Rose Mercer. They had settled into a life of comfortable, profound partnership. The farm was their sanctuary, a place of peace and hard, satisfying work. But their influence now extended far beyond their own fence line. John, the man who had once hidden from the world, was now the respected, pragmatic leader of the cooperative, his quiet wisdom the steady hand that guided them through the turbulent economic times. Rose had become the soul of the community. Her informal gatherings had blossomed into something more. The Mercer farmhouse parlor was now the unofficial community center, a place where women gathered to quilt and can, where children came for help with their lessons after school, and where any family facing a hardship knew they could find a warm meal and a compassionate listening ear. She was the matriarch of their sprawling, chosen family. They had everything they had ever dreamed of: peace, purpose, and a deep, abiding love. Yet, in the quiet moments of the evening, After the last neighbor had gone home, a small, unspoken sadness would sometimes linger in the air. The house, though often full, felt empty in a very specific way. The sound they both secretly longed for, the sound of a child's laughter echoing in the halls, was missing. They were a family, but they had not been blessed with children of their own. The catalyst for the final, most important chapter of their lives came, as their journey so often had, in the form of a tragedy. The Millers, a young, hard-working family in the co-op, were returning from a trip to a neighboring county when their truck skidded on an icy patch of road. The accident was a terrible one, instantly claiming the lives of both the husband and the wife. They left behind a single, small survivor, a 5-year-old boy named Daniel, who had been miraculously thrown clear of the wreckage. The news devastated the small, close-knit community. Daniel was an orphan, his only living relatives a distant, elderly aunt in another state who was in no position to care for a young boy. The town immediately rallied around him, taking him in, but his future was a heartbreakingly uncertain question mark. When John and Rose heard the news, they looked at each other, and in that single shared glance a profound, unspoken decision was made. They went to see the pastor that evening. They sat in his quiet study, the same place where they had planned their own wedding. "We would like to adopt him," John said, his voice quiet but firm. "We would like to give Daniel our home and our name." The pastor looked at them, at this quiet, middle-aged couple who had already given so much to their community. He saw the love and the unwavering resolve in their eyes. "The boy has been through a terrible ordeal," the pastor said gently. "He is heartbroken. He needs more than just a roof over his head. He needs a mother and a father." "We know," Rose said, her voice full of a deep maternal warmth. "That is what we intend to be." And so, Daniel Miller came to live at the Mercer farm. The first few weeks were difficult. The boy was lost in a silent, shell-shocked world of grief. He would not speak. He would sit for hours, staring out the window, his small face a mask of sorrow. He would wake in the night, crying from terrible nightmares. John and Rose did not push him. They simply surrounded him with a quiet, patient, and unconditional love. Rose would cook him his favorite meals, read him stories by the fire even when he seemed not to be listening, and sit with him in silence when he was too sad to speak. John, the quiet war veteran, found a new, profound purpose. He who knew the landscape of trauma so well became the boy's gentle guide. He would take Daniel on his daily rounds of the farm, not forcing conversation, but simply sharing his world. He would show him how to feed the chickens, how to mend a fence, how to identify the constellations in the vast night sky. The breakthrough came one crisp spring morning. They were in the barn, and John was showing Daniel the new litter of puppies that Buster's mate had just had. One small, clumsy puppy stumbled out of the pile and tumbled into Daniel's lap. The boy looked down at the tiny, wriggling creature, and for the first time since the accident, a small, watery smile touched his lips. He began to gently stroke the puppy's soft fur. Later that day, Rose found Daniel sitting on the porch, the small puppy asleep in his lap. He was humming a small, quiet tune. He looked up at her as she approached, his eyes, for the first time, clear and free from the shadows. "I think I will name him Lucky," he said, his voice a small, rusty whisper. It was the first time he had spoken a full sentence since his arrival. Tears streamed down Rose's face as she knelt and wrapped her arms around the small boy. He hesitated for a moment, then his own small arms wrapped around her neck, holding on tight. That evening, as the three of them sat at the kitchen table sharing a simple meal, the house was filled with a new and beautiful sound, the sound of a child's tentative, happy chatter. John looked at Rose across the table, his heart so full of love it felt as if it might burst. He saw his wife, his partner, the woman who had healed his own broken soul, and he saw the boy, their son, a life they had saved, who was now in his own way, saving them. The lonely war veteran and the fugitive factory girl had found their ultimate purpose. They were no longer just building a community. They were building a family. Their legacy would not just be in the thriving fields of the cooperative, but in the future of this small, brave boy. The harvest of their life together, they both knew in that moment, was complete, and it was more abundant and more beautiful than they could have ever imagined. The years flowed by, turning the rich soil of the Mercer farm and the lives of those who tended it. The world outside their quiet corner of Kansas was once again convulsed by the horrors of war. But the community of Harmony Creek, fortified by the cooperative John and Rose had built, faced this new challenge with a quiet, unified strength. Their shared prosperity, born of a decade of mutual support, now fueled the nation's war effort, their abundant harvests a testament to the resilience of a community that had learned to stand together. The Mercer farmhouse was a beacon of warmth and stability. John and Rose grew old together, their love a deep, quiet river that flowed through the heart of their family and their town. They were no longer the haunted veteran and the frightened girl, but the respected and beloved patriarch and matriarch of their community, their wisdom sought, their kindness a constant, reassuring presence. Their son, Daniel, grew from a quiet, wounded boy into a fine young man. He inherited John's steady, honorable nature and Rose's compassionate heart. When the call to serve his country came, as it had for John a generation before, Daniel answered without hesitation. The day he was to leave for basic training, the three of them stood on the same dusty train platform where John had once watched a young Rose arrive in his life, though the context was now a world away. This was not a scene of desperation or uncertainty, but of love and sacrifice. John, now a man in his late 50s, his hair more silver than not, placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. He looked at Daniel, dressed in the crisp new uniform of a soldier, and saw not a boy going off to a glorious adventure, but a young man walking into the same fire that had nearly consumed him. But the look in John's eyes was not one of fear. It was one of profound, quiet pride. "You are a different man than I was when I left this town," John said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I went to war fighting for a world I barely understood. You are going to fight for a home you helped to build. Remember that. Remember this land, remember us. And let that be the compass that guides you back home." Rose hugged her son tightly, her heart aching with a mother's love and fear. She did not offer him words of glory or patriotism. She offered him a piece of herself. She pressed a small, worn copy of her favorite book of poetry into his hand. "For the quiet moments," she whispered, "so you never feel alone." As the train pulled away, carrying their son off to an unknown fate, John wrapped his arm around his wife, holding her close. They stood together, two soldiers on the home front, their hearts united in a shared prayer for their son's safe return. The war years were long and difficult. John and Rose worked tirelessly, leading the cooperative to produce record harvests for the war effort. Their farm became a gathering place, a source of strength and comfort for other families whose sons and daughters were overseas. Every letter from Daniel was a precious treasure, read and reread, his words a testament to the fine, honorable man he had become. He came home in the autumn of 1945, a decorated sergeant, a man who had seen the horrors of war but had not been broken by them. He returned not to a silent, haunted house, but to a joyous, welcoming community, to the open, loving arms of the only parents he had ever truly known. And he did not come home alone. With him was a young woman, a brave, kind army nurse named Sarah, whom he had met in a field hospital in France. In her eyes, John and Rose saw the same quiet strength and compassionate spirit that had first drawn them to each other. A new love story was beginning, a new chapter for the next generation. One perfect golden afternoon a few years later, the Mercer farm was the site of another wedding. This time, it was their son, Daniel, who stood under the old wooden arch in the garden, marrying the woman he loved. The entire town was there, a sprawling, happy family celebrating the continuation of a legacy. As the party continued in the barn, John and Rose, now in the comfortable twilight of their years, sat together on their familiar porch swing. They watched as their son danced with his new bride, their faces alight with the same hopeful joy they themselves had known. They saw their friends, their neighbors, the community they had built, all celebrating together. "You know," Rose said softly, her head resting on his shoulder, "I used to think my life was a tragedy, a story of loss and fear." "And now?" he asked, his own voice full of a deep, peaceful contentment. "Now I know it was a love story all along," she whispered. "It just had a very difficult beginning." He smiled, kissing the top of her silvered hair. He looked out at the thriving, happy community, at the son who was the embodiment of their love, at the farm that was a testament to their partnership. He had gone to war and returned a ghost. He had found a frightened, broken girl in a ditch. And from those desolate, lonely beginnings they had together cultivated a harvest of love so abundant, so beautiful, it would nourish their family and their town for generations to come. Their long battle was over, and their peace was perfect. The deepest wounds can be the very soil from which our greatest strengths grow. A life is not defined by the battles we have fought, but by the homes we build in the aftermath. True family is not a matter of blood, but of the people who stand with you in the trenches and welcome you home from the war. Do not fear the quiet, fallow seasons of your life, for it is in these moments of solitude that we can find the purpose that will allow our own and others' gardens to bloom again.